Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? We begin with the CCP virus and the evidence that suggests our assumptions that asymptomatic carriers may not be the risk of a more serious case. Evidence from South Korea, who have been one of the leading countries in both controlling and studying the CCP virus, shows that even if you do not exhibit the serious symptoms of a severe case of the CCP virus, you may still in fact be shedding and able to infect others at a similar level to those who have a severe case. This is a worrying line of evidence, since if, as we've continued to assume, young children, older children, adults without serious infections and so on, all were able to continue their life in relatively unhindered manners, might in fact be contributing to the large upswings we are seeing in the number of infections in a number of countries. Perhaps the only significant difference between those who are asymptomatic and those who were symptomatic in this study was a 2.5 day shorter recovery period, that is 17 days and 19.5 days. This study in and of itself is somewhat flawed, as it only followed about 300 people after an outbreak in a religious community. This sort of spread may explain why there has been a review of how the CCP virus would come and go. Originally, it was thought that we would have a series of waves of diminishing size as the CCP virus would come through, infect people, measures would be put in place, the virus would subside, people would become lax, and the virus would come back, and so the process would repeat. What it's now being described as is more like a forest fire, where it's going to ramp up and get worse over time, and we're going to have to fight to control it. If not that, then we're going to see an exponential growth, followed by a sudden and precipitous stop. One researcher used the analogy, it's just going to keep burning hot, kind of like a forest fire looking for human wood to burn. The reason researchers were expecting a wave-type approach to this was that we could model it in a similar manner to both the 1918 Spanish flu and the more recent swine flu outbreaks. Both of these came in waves. Other diseases that aren't as controllable, like SARS, came in at a fast, high burn, and they went away just as quickly. We see a similar problem with Ebola, where an outbreak will occur, and it will kill all of its hosts, and then go away. What we are seeing with the CCP virus is somewhere between these two, where it isn't killing everybody, but it's dangerous enough to cause a lot of harm. On the other hand, it's also not burning out because of this. While talking about how it spreads and possible risk, there's an article in The Conversation by Pediatricians looking at the possible risk for children. Their opinion in this article is that if you are 17 years or younger, there is less risk, but there's likely a good chance that all children have some asymptomatic or mild cases. Going back to the earlier point, there is a possibility that they could then be spreading the virus to others. They make the point that of the CCP cases in the United States of America, only 1.7 are represented in children, but children make up 22% of the total population. Then we also need to account for the fact that, given the nature of children's immune systems and bodies in general, they are less likely to need to be tested as they do not exhibit the symptoms of the CCP virus. The concern is that young children are exhibiting extreme responses to it when they are infected. This is compounded by evidence from South Korea that children between the ages of 10 to 19 years old can spread the virus just as well as an adult can. This means that younger children and teenagers can do just as much harm as an adult. The question is whether or not the children will be infected in the first place, and whether we can accurately record whether or not they have been infected. This means we may have artificially deflated the figures for children through selective testing and a lack of ability to identify cases. While talking about spread and similar, we should mention the protests in Berlin against the coronavirus restrictions. particularly the requirement for wearing a mask. Many of the protesters held up placards reading that corona was a false alarm, that there's a natural defense instead of vaccination, and end the corona panic. These things all fly in the face of the fact that there has now been an increase in the cases of CCP virus in Germany. The Berlin protesters are either ignorant or in denial about this fact. There's an adage which can be summarily described as complacency breeds contempt, and the fact that Germany has been able to roll back some of its more restrictive public policies around the CCP virus, but not necessarily the social distancing rules, means people are becoming more and more complacent. Until it comes back into force and the CCP virus takes a toll on them again, it's likely these protesters will continue with their inane and asinine activities. While talking about the CCP virus, we should consider who is and is not at risk, given that the protesters could well be responsible for the recent record high of 915 cases. That underlines the fact that Germany is experiencing an increase again. Who is and is not at risk of being infected by it could largely be attributed to whether or not your immune system is ready to fight it. A recent study has indicated that some people who have been exposed to the novel CCP virus could well have some immunity to it based on exposure to a prior coronavirus in the form of the common cold. The CCP virus is a form of coronavirus, as is the common cold, influenza, and SARS. The difference between them is largely genomic, but the family is the same. This means that, to a certain extent, there are similarities in what the cell looks like, how it behaves, and certain surface proteins. The immune system often relies on these surface proteins, sugars, and more to be able to identify foreign pathogens and respond to them. This means that if your body has been trained, as it is with a vaccine, to identify these components and then attack them, there's a good chance your body could be more effectively resisting and dealing with the CCP virus. The way to train it is normally through exposure to something like a vaccine, where the body is given a taste or a small sample of a virus, bacteria, and more that it can then take back to other cells and use to train the immune system. If the immune system is trained to identify something common to a variety of pathogens, which could in this case cover the CCP virus, there is a chance that specific cells, known as T cells, could more effectively deal with it. A study that found this is using a very small cohort. It's blood samples taken between 2015 and 2018 from 25 people. Therefore, we're going to have some trouble extrapolating these results, but they do fit into the wider model we understand for the immune system's methodologies and operation. What they found was that of these people, there were a number of who had never been exposed to the coronavirus. That is, they had no reason to have any kind of immunity to it. Yet, for some reason, they had this particular immunity to both the CCP virus and 4 common cold coronaviruses. This study has been further reinforced by studies in the Netherlands, the USA, Germany, Singapore, the UK, and more. While you may be somewhat immune based on your own history of infections, that does not mean you'll be entirely immune. Along with the differences we're seeing in children, particularly older children and adults, this creates the prospective situation in which you may still be infected and you may still be able to infect others. This is exactly what's being seen at USC in California. This is an American university where a number of fraternity houses are at the hub of an infection issue. That is, a number of fraternities are being identified as the common point for a number of cases of the CCP virus and the way it's spreading. This makes sense after USC and other universities in America have shut down their face-to-face teaching and moved online. It means the only common place where a number of students should be gathering and interacting with each other are these fraternity houses or similar accommodation. It might just be the folly of youth where we're seeing similar behavior in Alabama. We're seeing an increase in infections at USC in California, and likely in other universities as well. It's an issue to do with the willingness to take certain risks among certain age groups, and the fact that these people in this age group are less likely to experience severe symptoms. Therefore, they can wind up taking more risks unnecessarily and not paying the same toll, at least immediately. Being able to identify these widespread, relatively asymptomatic cases is important, and it's why there's been a greater push by a number of rather well-established academics to have less accurate and not necessarily as reliable testing kits available for the whole population at a much reduced cost. The current approach in the USA and other countries has been to use more accurate, more reliable, but more expensive and difficult to deploy test kits. The hope is that if they were to roll out quicker, cheaper, but less accurate testing, then it could be done several times a week by most people, therefore allowing tracking of the spread of the coronavirus, allowing people to take action when they become aware and limit the possible risk they expose to themselves and others. The current approach has all largely been very similar to blood samples and similar taken, sent off to a lab and giving an accurate result, much like a pregnancy test conducted by a phlebotomist. By contrast, what the push has been towards, particularly by one Michael Mina, is to have something similar to a home-based pregnancy test kit, something you can put a small sample of saliva or similar on and have a result in short order, similar to a urination pregnancy test kit. Rather than wait several days to a week to get your results, you would have them in minutes. Something similar is being seen particularly in Taiwan and South Korea, where relatively quick testing is being done and allowing people to get notifications via text message that tell them whether or not they need to take action to limit the exposure they give others to them if they are infected. Slowing down the spread like this, and taking into account the fact that we are seeing an increasing number of infections, and we have concerns about the fact that many people may not be identified as infected due to a lack of symptoms, we then need to account for the possibilities of long-term effects. One of these has come out now that there may be longer-term issues with an increased rate of psychiatric disorders from those who have survived the CCP virus. This is yet again a relatively small-scale study involving a little over 400 patients. What they found was that 55% of those who came out the other end of the CCP virus also had at least one psychiatric disorder show up. The self-assessment questionnaires found that there was a 28% incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder, 31% depression, 42% anxiety. There was also 40% incidences of insomnia and 20% of obsessive-compulsive symptoms. We now need to add these onto the already existing list of possible brain disorders, stroke, heart attack, lung dysfunction, and more that we are seeing as a longer-term byproduct of having been infected with the CCP virus. Going now from the CCP virus, we can look at another phenomena that's surprising everyone. That is the explosion in Beirut. In general, it's estimated that the explosion of the fertilizer stored there is equivalent to several hundred tons of TNT. There was some concern for a time that this blast, which has had some notoriety not just for what it was, but for the mushroom cloud that showed up after the fact, could have been a nuclear weapons explosion. It's now established that the warehouse was improperly storing more than 2.5 tons of ammonium nitrate. Ammonium nitrate is highly volatile and readily explodes. This is why the explosion registered as a 3.3 magnitude earthquake. To give some context to the concerns, the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had an estimated yield of about 15 kilotons. This explosion was many times less than that, but still, having any kind of explosion in the center of a city like that is not going to be good for anyone, and is why there was such misfortune following it with the number of deaths and injuries involved. The only soul-saving grace is that the explosion was relatively uncontained, meaning much of the force went up, rather than out. This led to many of the buildings being damaged in the local area, but the explosion could have been a lot worse. Going now from misfortune, we can look at a symbol of success, the giant panda, and be disappointed that our efforts at conservation have in fact had the opposite effect in some areas. There has been a great increase in effort for the conservation of pandas since the 1980s. This has involved 67 panda reserves and a number of wildlife conservation areas. There have been huge projects with international zoos cooperating to try and breed them. These projects have been successful as we have gone from 1,000 pandas living in the wild in the 70s to over 1,864 in the wild today. Again, good news for the pandas. Not good news for the ecosystem and ecology where these reserves and similar have been set up. The projects over the last 10 years have led to a large decrease in large carnivores, those being leopards, snow leopards, wolves, and a breed of Asian wild dog. In fact, what may have happened is in our efforts to prevent the panda from going extinct, we have forced both the wolf and the Asian wild dog species to be functionally extinct in the same regions. This owes to the nature of targeting one species rather than an entire ecology. Pandas were a carnivore turned herbivore. They live predominantly on bamboo. They retain a small habitat area. The 4 species we've mentioned, who are large predators, require large areas and are somewhat nomadic. This means providing with a small region to survive in isn't going to work, and it's a phenomena we're seeing not just with giant pandas, but with other species for which we have used the same methodology and approach. In news related to another species for which conservation efforts have been in effect for quite a while now, the large number of elephants dying in Botswana might actually have a more natural reason behind it. It's currently thought that the more than 300 elephants that have died in Botswana may well have been killed by naturally produced poisons and toxins from bacteria. Many bacteria, such as botulinum, Shigella, and even some E. coli, can produce toxins. They secrete these as a defensive mechanism. If they're in stagnant water, they could well be secreting it into the water, which the elephants then drink and become poisoned. This would explain why the number of elephants dying hasn't been reflective of any one particular group, both sexes and every age. This means that we could well have been seeing a naturally occurring mass poisoning by nature. While on the topic of poisons and similar toxic materials, it's possible that spider webs are covered in a neurotoxin. This may help them in subduing, killing, and then consuming their prey. If you've been worried about spiders by themselves, you now need to add their spider webs to your list of worries. The idea with this is that they may be covered in a poison. This poison is really interesting because it's on top of the fact that the spider web is already incredibly strong. The spider silk is also very sticky and elastic. This means it can be used in a variety of ways, and spiders do just that, whether it's to store their prey, create their web, egg sacs, and more. The research focuses on one particular family of spiders, these being the orb weavers. Orb weavers are particularly well known in terms of their popularity, but not necessarily their characteristics. It's such a large family and so diverse that they can have a lot of different features. That is where this particular study of the T. clavips particular species of orb weaver comes in. Orb weavers can produce a variety of types of silk, in fact up to 7. Some of these have specific purposes, as we've mentioned, like wrapping up eggs, creating their web, or holding prey. What they've also found is that each of these glands could also produce a different neurotoxin. This is similar to venom in a manner of speaking. These toxins could then sit on the spider silk. It would act as almost like an oil. That would mean it could be safely kept there without having to worry about being washed away. Prey would come across this, come in contact with it, and then become infected in a manner of speaking. Once they were poisoned, they would be paralyzed and then subject to the spider's natural prey instincts, or put into storage to be eaten later. While on the topic of a spider web of various kinds, we should mention the current Senate hearing into Facebook and other companies, particularly the unpleasant and unfortunate way Mark Zuckerberg was very effectively cornered and made to, if not addressed now, very soon, the possibility of lying to the government. His testimony before Congress could well have put Facebook and other media companies square in the spotlight. The concern here is whether or not they are not only biased, but whether or not they are actively having issues with censoring and controlling the various political and personal viewpoints of staff and users of the platform. In the lead up to the 2020 elections, this could be a very serious issue, particularly given past claims of interference and possibly lawsuits regarding the role of government and the ability of social media platforms to limit the reach of those either running for government positions or those who already hold them, particularly the Twitter lawsuits demanding access to Trump and his ability to block people on that platform. Our final piece of news for the week is all about how SpaceX has just brought their 2 astronaut guinea pigs back to Earth. This means SpaceX has just achieved a historic feat. They have, as a private company, been able to take people to space and bring them back from American soil. Previously, America has been relying on the Soyuz crew capsules from Russia that would take their astronauts into space, particularly to the ISS, and then bring them back again. The fact that America has gone back to using their own American companies was a big thing, and the question has been how effectively could they work, and how effective could SpaceX and other companies be in developing their own technology that would work. There was many teething issues with the SpaceX technology, particularly the Crew Dragon, and SpaceX's own rockets, where they would catch fire or explode. The successful launch and then return of the crew means that SpaceX is well on its way to achieving its goal, and it means America can once again start deploying astronauts and other space-based technology from its own shores. Even during a briefing, Elon Musk himself had to say, "To be totally frank, I doubted us too. I thought we had maybe, when starting SpaceX, maybe had a 10% chance of reaching orbit. So to those who doubted us, I was like, well, I think you're probably right." He then added, "It took us 4 attempts just to get to orbit with Falcon 1. He then later added, "So, hey, I think those doubters their probability assessment was correct, but fortunately, fate has smiled upon us and brought us to this day." And this brings America back into the space race, going from Earth to the ISS, and then the Moon, and hopefully one day Mars. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.